What's up boys, my name is Lynx. In this video I'm going to be going over a bunch of tips towards Final Fantasy XIV tanking that have helped me achieve rank 1 and become a better player overall. Now you may be wondering who I am and why you should listen to me. My name is Lynx Kameli. I have been tanking since 2016 in Alexander the Creator. I have improved from a purple player to an orange player to a rank 1 player in a span of 3 years. I have over 8,500 hours in Final Fantasy XIV, and I would say 70% of that time has been tanking. I have spent a lot of time improving, theory crafting, and really getting deep into tanking, getting super nerdy about it, and I feel like I have achieved all my goals. I have hit rank 1 multiple times. I've held rank 1 speed records in every ultimate in the game. I have hit everything I've wanted to accomplish in the game, and now I want to share that information to you guys to help you improve. Before we begin, I'd like to put out some disclaimers. Number one is I am not a speedrunner. I am a progression player. That's what I focus on. I optimize my play during progression in the first week, and that's when I achieve my rank 1s. This guide and what I do is focused on progression and getting those early kills and being really impactful in your team during those early kills. This guide assumes you already know a pretty good amount about your class and how to do damage and how to play in FF as a tank. I'm not going to be teaching you how to play your class. I am not going to be going super in depth about specific class details. This is a guide about tanking mentality and how to improve your play through how you think about the game. And before I get people yelling at me in the comments, I am going to have points and topics in this video that you may disagree on. There are different ways to play the game. There are different ways to tank. You can have different mentalities while tanking. That is completely fine. This is simply the one that I have. This is what has brought me my success, and that's what I'm going to pass on to you guys. The first thing you need to understand is that you are a DPS. Now this might sound counterintuitive because you're a tank, right? Well, you are a DPS that has cooldowns, you are a DPS that holds the boss, you are a DPS with mitigation tools. Every GCD you press will do damage. That means your damage per second is just as important as anybody else's. I know many really good tanks that are struggling on this specific topic, and it holds them back from being great. If you master this mentality that you are a DPS and you implement that into your play, you will become better overnight. When you think about the game in terms of damage and how much damage you can do and how to get as much damage out of everyone in your team, you will get better. Now there are many ways to capitalize on this mentality of you being a DPS. First of all, do not ever forego your defense for more damage. If you're purposely cucking healers and taking way more damage than you should be, that's not being a good player, you're just being a scumbag. You should always balance safe damage intake with as much damage as you can put out. Now the most important aspect of you playing as a DPS is understanding your melee DPS in your party. Having great boss positioning, not moving the boss erratically so the melees miss their positionals. This is what improves you as a tank. This is probably the number one thing to care about when you're tanking, is boss positioning and catering to your melees. Me and my melees work together to achieve maximum uptime for all of us. I try very hard to give full positional uptime to them. Now with True North, this has been devalued in Shadowbringers. However, it is still a very important topic to focus on. So some things to focus on. Number one, don't spin the boss ever. If you have to turn the boss, obviously. But if you're running in circles, if you're running around, if you're trying to reposition and push him it's not worth it. Keep the boss where it is and make it consistent. 9 times out of 10, if the boss is in a wrong position, you can salvage that. Get one spot, focus on keeping the boss there during the mechanic. If it doesn't end up there and it's a little bit off, tough, that's fine. If we look at this example of me during Shiva, you can see that my melees are getting full uptime, we're all together, and when we go to spread here for our stack, immediately after the stack goes off, I go directly back in front of the boss. The boss turns very little. My melees don't have to worry about that. They can do full uptime on their positionals. This is what I'm talking about. When you can put yourself in a position where the boss does not turn, where it will always face the same direction, and your melees do not have to factor in you turning as a part of their positionals. Now, up next, I want to talk about keeping your GCD rolling all the time. This will vary on skill level and fight confidence, but if you are not pressing a GCD every single time your GCD is up and you're in melee range, you're simply playing incorrectly. There is almost no scenario besides getting a blighted debuff where you are melee and you cannot press a GCD. Your GCD should be spinning 24/7. When you look at my clear videos and you see me on the boss, you'll see that my GCD is rolling infinitely. I try very hard to make sure that as soon as my GCD is up, it is hit and I am rolling that GCD. You should be pressing a skill every time you possibly can. A lot of players you'll see when they're learning a fight or they're not very comfortable will freeze up, they'll stop pressing their actions, they'll just move their character around, and that's okay the very first time, maybe the first and second time you're learning a mechanic, but you need to get confident enough in your ability to press your buttons without thinking about them that when you are doing a mechanic, you are still doing your rotation. You can practice this on a training dummy. Press your rotation without looking at your hotbar. Do your 1, 2, 3. Do your combos, press your buttons, get used to rolling your GCD 24/7. Now obviously if you're pressing the wrong buttons, you're not really getting much out of this tip, but if you can do your rotation flawlessly without thinking about it, you will overnight improve your damage an insane amount. Getting as many GCDs into the boss as possible is the #1 tip to improve your damage. A very important aspect of pressing your GCDs every single time they're up is how you can learn fights based on your GCD. This is how I have learned every single fight I have done since probably the end of Heavensward. I know timings, I know when to press my cooldowns, I know when to move my character for mechanics based on my GCD. Now this is very skill speed dependent, and if you're swapping gear or you're upgrading your gear and your skill speed is changing a bit as you're going through farm, this might be harder to do, but generally speaking, learning fights based on your GCD, especially when you're progressing them, is extremely valuable. I rarely ever look at timers, I rarely ever remember specific points where things are happening in a fight. I can tell you when things are happening based on where in my rotation I am, based on when my next delirium or my next inner release is going to come up. That's how I learn the fight, and I think it is extremely valuable because you can get precise cooldown timings based on your GCD. If you know after my 5th heavy swing in this phase I have to press Rampart, then every single time you do that phase, that Rampart will be there. That Rampart will be on time in the exact same spot. You lower a lot of player error when you start thinking in this way. You can pinpoint exact moments in your rotation where you need to do things, and that will be extremely consistent as long as you're consistent in pressing your GCDs. On that topic, let's talk about skill speed. The balance will show you a BIS list that has a set skill speed, or maybe you don't have multiple skill speeds and you don't really know which one is the best until you're doing the fights at those skill speeds. There are times when the balance will put out a best in slot list with a GCD that just doesn't cater to a fight in the tier. Specifically in Shiva, I've needed to create my own BIS list because the GCDs provided by the balance actually caused me to lose GCDs in the fight, and more often than not, losing a couple direct hit or a little bit of det or a little bit of crit to gain an extra GCD is a bigger damage increase than those substats. I'm not calling out the balance here and saying they're wrong. I use the balance for my BIS list pretty much every tier, but there are times, specifically like Shiva, where I've needed to create my own list just so that I can get the maximum damage possible. When you're doing a fight, if you notice that your GCD is almost up but isn't as you have to run out of melee, that's a good indicator that you should bump up your skill speed and get to the next tier and see if that fixes it. More often than not, a simple 0.01 GCD increase, like the next skill speed tier, will be enough to fix that issue. You'll get an extra GCD in the fight, and that's more damage than having more substats in crit or det or direct. Now don't go crazy with this. Don't get a ton of skill speed to get an extra GCD. I'm talking maybe 1 or 2 tiers extra over the balances, and that's pretty good. Sometimes you might even want to go slower than the balance. Sometimes you might want to go faster like I'm talking about. It really depends on the fight, and you need to figure this out for yourself. Another really big thing here is to save 1 charge of your gap closer almost all the time, especially during progression. You'll see me when I'm learning, I will always keep at least 1 charge of my gap closer just in case something happens that is unpredictable or I need to use it in an emergency. When you're comfortable in a fight, yeah, you can spend your charges, and I do that often once I'm comfortable, but saving at least one charge of your gap closer, sometimes two if you really need it, but you almost never really need to, is very, very important. There are lots of mechanics these days in Final Fantasy that require you to run out of melee quickly and then move back in to maintain full uptime. And your gap closer is there to mitigate the movement you have to do. I know it might be tempting to press the button as soon as the charge is up because it does damage, but you will get more damage from lowering the time that you are not pressing a GCD than you will by pressing your gap closer on cooldown. There are many times in Shiva specifically where I have to run out for axe kick and then I gap close back in. And I've saved maybe a half a second of running back in, and that is actually a higher damage increase than if I were to just press my gap closer. Now this is a big one, so I saved it for last. RDPS versus ADPS. This is a really big topic to me specifically because I hate RDPS. I think RDPS metrics for tanks make no sense. Since tanks do not contribute any raid buffs, your RDPS is specifically calculated only on the damage that you do, regardless of any damage buff that hits your character. So what that means is, if you use Delirium right before every single raid buff, and then you lose all that buffed damage that you would have gained if you saved Delirium, your RDPS will be higher than if you held on to that Delirium. RDPS does not care about external buffs. It only cares about what you are doing on your character. And that might be great if you're trying to compare your damage to somebody else's just based on if you can press your buttons. But when you're really optimizing your play, RDPS falls behind in terms of showing true skill. ADPS, on the other hand, will show you the damage that you are doing with raid buffs calculated into your damage output. Now you might be saying, why is that a good thing when someone can bring 10 buff classes and just explode their damage on burst? That's very niche, very rare, and it's not something that I really consider as like an overwhelming problem. That whole idea of padded parses has kind of been thrown out the window since single target buffs like the balance getting put on somebody don't calculate into ADPS anyways. It is simply raid buffs. So to me, ADPS is a much more meaningful metric because there are many times in a fight where you will want to hold your cooldowns to line them up with raid buffs. Now I'm not talking you're going to hold Delirium for every 2-minute window, but if you're playing with a monk, like I do, and his Brotherhood is 3-4 seconds late, I'm going to wait on my Delirium until I see Brotherhood, and then I will use my Delirium, so every Blood Spiller in that Delirium gets a 5% damage buff. The big issue between RDPS and ADPS in my mind comes from that to get a high RDPS parse, you have to play as if you are the only person in the fight. I think it's really bad to show true skill through RDPS. It just doesn't really make sense. A high RDPS parse often has lower actual damage output than a high ADPS parse. That's because a high RDPS parse doesn't care about external buffs, so you don't have to worry about them. Another level of play to your tanking is to start using ADPS and caring about raid buffs, where they are, how they line up, where you can put your cooldowns so that you can utilize raid buffs effectively. I see tons of tanks just using their cooldowns as soon as they're up. IR is up, hit it. Delirium's up, hit it. This is okay, but when you want to reach the next level, you need to start lining up those buffs with raid buffs. I would say 80% of my gameplay while tanking is focused on raid buffs, my next burst window. Because so much of your damage comes from burst, you want to make sure you are capitalizing on that burst as much as possible. So that means using Delirium with Brotherhood every single time. That means using Living Shadow with 2-minute buffs every single time. Yes, there are going to be times in niche specific scenarios where you have to use your buff in a way that doesn't line up. Okay, that can happen. But generally speaking, you want to put your big cooldowns inside raid buffs. This is what will excel you from being a 95 percentile good tank to a 99 percentile amazing tank, is getting your damage in buff windows. The way I have taught this to every single person that I have talked to about this topic is use your DPS cooldowns as internal timers for when the next burst window is. If you use Delirium with Brotherhood, then you know, since they both have a 90-second cooldown, when your Delirium is up, Brotherhood is going to be up. So you can pool your resource, you can save things so that the next time that your Delirium comes up, Brotherhood is up, you press them together, you do 5% extra damage on every Blood Spiller plus, you know, whatever else, the auto attacks and everything in between. It might be hard at first to try to line everything up with raid buffs, such as putting No Mercy inside Trick Attack or getting Living Shadow I mean, that one's pretty easy, actually. Forget about that, that's really easy. Generally speaking, the 60-second buffs and the 90-second buffs are the ones that require the most attention. Because they happen so frequently and your rotation relies on those 60-second and 90-second timings, that means that's what you're going to focus on. Every 60 seconds, if you're playing with a class that gives a 60-second raid buff, such as Trick Attack, you want to have something for it. So for Warrior, you want to save an Inner Chaos to put in Trick Attack. For Dark Knight, you want to save your mana so you can put in a Touch of Edge of Shadows. For Gunbreaker, you want to save your No Mercy so it lines up with Trick Attack. That one's a little bit harder to do because Gunbreaker relies on, you know, specific GCDs, and if you use a 3rd tier combo with a 2 charge, Gunbreaker is a little complicated. Let's just say that. But generally speaking, for Paladin, you can have a Fight or Flight up for every Trick Attack. You can have a Requiescat for every Trick Attack if that's the opener you're using. You can have something every 60 to 90 seconds, and then you will keep it lined up with that 60 to 90 second window. This is what will propel you as a tank. Now, does it give you a crazy high RDPS parse? No, it doesn't. I have lost to many people on RDPS while maintaining a rank 1 ADPS. It's a little bit weird to have the two and different metrics, but I would say focus on ADPS. It will cause you to do more actual damage, and that makes the boss die faster. Alright boys, that's all I've got for now. There's a lot more I could go into. I mean, I could talk about tanking for hours, but that's pretty much the basics of getting better from 95 to, let's say, 99 percentile. If you guys want a part 2 to this, let me know. I can add on, I can do fight specifics, whatever. I am down to make more guides about tanking because I could literally go on forever. But this video is getting kind of long. Thank you guys for watching. I don't really upload very often, so subscribe if you want to. I'm not going to ask for it. But yeah, you can check my Twitch also. I don't stream right now because I only stream art progression. But that's it. See you guys later. Peace.